Great. Hi, all, and welcome back for part two of the lecture for week 5. Hopefully this one will go a bit more smoothly without interrupting toddlers and chocolate labs who are also misbehaving. So the second part of this lecture is going to focus on the growing national economy and also give you a little bit more background again into the snapshots of what life was like during this time period. And so to get us started, I share with you this graphic from the American pageant. And basically what it shows us is from 1790 to 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, how the population of the United States both did and didn't change. You can see here that all segments of the population do increase, both white and non-white, and the population as a whole does steadily increase during this era. And that, of course, is something that we've seen through several previous eras. One thing that might be of interest, though, is the fact that the percentage of the non-white population, which we're really talking at this point about enslaved Africans, has actually diminished as part of the overall population by 1860. And we're going to delve into that a bit further next week. But I did want to point that out while I had this particular graphic up there to show you how things are changing to some degree as we are looking at this particular aspect of this era. And you'll also notice that this particular chart doesn't show us the breakdown of where these individuals are and are not living, but the population of the United States is still largely rural. There are, by this point in time, though, 20 cities of some size, and that size being of 20,000 people or more as the marker, which again is smaller than the size of the city of Stanton today. So certainly we're not a very urban country at this point in our nation's history. Now, one of the ways that the population was growing was through an influx of immigrants. And by the mid 19th century, most of those immigrants were coming from two places in the world, Ireland and Germany. And we talked way back at the beginning of the course about how the Columbian Exchange is actually going to drive this portion of the immigration. Because of introducing the crop of potatoes to the Irish during the era of the Columbian Exchange, then becoming incredibly dependent upon it. And then with the blight of the potato crop in the early 1840s, the Irish are essentially starving and seeking opportunities to leave Ireland, and the United States provides that opportunity. We also have a large influx of individuals coming over from Germany. Unlike the Irish, many of the Germans who came here did not settle along the East Coast in urban areas. Most of them actually migrated to the Midwest. And there are still many individuals in areas like Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin today that can link back to settlements from this era. The downside of this immigration pattern, though, was that both of these groups were looked down upon by many who were considering themselves to be Native Americans. And I say Native Americans not in the sense of indigenous peoples, but native born to the United States. Many of them essentially and conveniently forgot that their families, too, had migrated to the New World. From mainly European countries, and they looked down upon these immigrants. They viewed the Germans as strange and drunk and unable to assimilate into the society, and they viewed the Irish also as being too affected by the drink, as being low class and lazy, and also being hyper-controlled by the Pope. As you can see implied by this political cartoon here on the left side of the screen. The reality of the matter is, while both population groups certainly did like to have a good time, both were incredibly hard workers and contributed a lot to American society during that time period. Still, the nativist movement sprang up in response. The nativist movement is exactly what it sounds like. It's a group of individuals who were native born to a country being opposed to those who are emigrating here, regardless of the reason that they are coming here. And I'm sure you could never imagine that happening. But one of the other things that this resulted in was an actual political movement that became known as the Know Nothing political party. And the Know Nothing political party actually emerged as what was presumably a secret society called the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. But because it was a secret society, when people would ask them about it, their response would be, "I know nothing." And what became almost in jest, the response for this actually became the banner for a brief-lived political party in American history. Now, as these individuals were coming into the United States and as other Americans were moving westward, excuse me, the center of the nation's population also moved west. And you can see here by studying this map that this movement has continued. And you'll see in 1790, and this map, by the way, is better displayed in your textbook. In 1790, the center point of the population, not too surprisingly, was not very far from where Washington, D.C. is located. And then by 2000, it is southwest of St. Louis, Missouri, and is not very far off that point today. So many individuals, including these new immigrants, were seeking expansion to the west, but they were also expanding in the urban environment. And for those of you that are taking History 122, we'll delve into this quite a bit after we tackle the topic of Reconstruction. Ultimately, America had four major characteristics that would enable it to become an industrial powerhouse. And this movement towards being an industrial powerhouse began in this pre-Civil War era. Cheap land was plentiful, even on the East Coast, which was not that highly settled at this point in time. The workers were plentiful in both a burgeoning native population as well as many immigrants coming in, and access to plentiful raw materials, because America, as we know, even still today, is quite large in size and blessed with many natural resources. And then with all of these people living here, there were also very many individuals to consume the goods that would be manufactured by American industry. Although America still struggled to compete with the British in manufacturing, the War of 1812, as you saw in your exploration, did help put us on firmer footing in that era. And then post-war tariffs, like the tariff of 1816, continued to solidify our status as a manufacturing nation. Game-changing inventions at this time were numerous. Just to give you a real quick idea of the impact of inventions during this era, in the 1790s, in the decade of the 1790s, only 300 patents were actually taken out by American inventors. In the first decade that our nation existed under the Constitution. By the 1850s, the number of inventions were up into the 30 and 40 thousands. And so the number of patents increased immensely. And so all of this collectively would help America grow and would be quite monumental. The mechanized thread spinner, which of course took cotton and made it into thread for textiles, was groundbreaking. This was brought over by an English immigrant who was seeking a way to make a life in the New World. The cotton gin, which was actually invented by Eli Whitney, in the 1790s, would have the impact not only of allowing cotton to be processed much faster and then sent on to the textile mills in New England, but also, unfortunately, would lead to a resurgence in slavery because of the fact that now that the cotton could be processed much more quickly, it was much more in demand by the textile mills, and this then indirectly led to an increase in enslaved individuals. The invention of the sewing machine by Isaiah Singer, the telegraph invented by Samuel Morse, which allowed communication to occur at a much more rapid rate. The concept of limited liability corporations, LLCs, you've probably heard that term. And essentially, what an LLC is it's a protective company, an umbrella company, if you will, where an investor would only lose what he had invested in the business, not everything he or she owned. So it would protect them from liability for the products of a business that they were investing in. The invention of the steel plow by John Deere is going to enable farmers to cut into the fertile but hard Midwestern soil. And of course, the invention of the mechanical reaper by Cyrus McCormick, just down the road here in Rockbridge County, would allow for much greater expansion of the harvesting of grains such as wheat, as well as the formation of the International Harvester Company, which would be based out of Chicago. Now, unfortunately, with all of this growth, there would be a dark side. And the main dark side, of course, was the exploitation of the workers, who came to be known as wage slaves. Conditions in the typical factory were not good. Conditions were unsafe, they were unhealthy, hours were long, and wages were low. Child labor was all too common, and childhood really didn't exist, as you can see here by the images of the young men on the right side of the screen. These are all very young children who really essentially don't have a childhood. The conditions for the adult workers weren't much better, and many of those adult workers by this point in American history included women. And one of the things that many of these workers sought to do beginning in the 1820s and 30s was to expand protections for workers. They were not very successful, but again, if you're with me still for History 122, we'll talk about some of the more successful endeavors in this area. The only real big impact that actually was had for the labor unions was that federal government under Martin Van Buren actually capped themselves at a 10-hour workday, which today to many would still seem appalling. But of course, many of us do put those days in, even at non-federal jobs. Although more women began to work at this time, the women were still largely expected to be mostly at home. And you're going to be doing an activity this week, which is going to have you take a look at the Seneca Falls Convention and the Seneca Falls Declaration, which was one of the very first national attempts to better the situation of these women and seeing women as more important because of their roles both in the workplace and at home. This time period also brought about many changes in transportation. The highway system greatly expanded. Roads that were actually paved in hard surface stretching from one city to another. The very first one was the Lancaster Turnpike, today the Philadelphia Turnpike, which went from Philadelphia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And if you've driven on it recently, you probably know that it hasn't been paved since the 1800s. Steamboats during this time period were also growing in number. The very first steamboat was invented by Robert Fulton in 1807. And this is going to radically change the transportation structure because rivers and waterways are now two-way streets, not one way in the direction that they're flowing. And this is going to specifically impact the South and the West. Canals also saw a big boom during this time period. Of course, the granddaddy of all these canals was the Erie Canal, which was built by New York Governor DeWitt Clinton using state money. It was a project that lasted 8 years and was absolutely transcendental because it linked the Western rivers with the Atlantic Ocean through the Great Lakes. It significantly diminished shipping costs to dropping them 20 times over. So what had previously cost $100 to ship now was only $5. It also effectively sold much of the trade from the Mississippi River. However, it would, that would ultimately see a resurgence as well on the Mississippi with the steamboats. And the Erie Canal also allowed for Western cities like Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago to boom. The short-lived Pony Express also existed during this era, although we often see many romanticized things about the Pony Express. The Pony Express was actually only in existence for 2 years before being replaced by a transcontinental telegraph wire, which gave instant communication. But still, it's something that was very notable and encouraged many people to settle west because of the impact of better access to mail. Cables like this transcontinental telegraph wire were also certainly game changers. And it was in 1858 that we actually laid the very first transatlantic cable to Britain. And although it only held up for 3 weeks, it would be the start of our ability to have more instant access to the European continent. Clipper ships were also invented during this era and utilized mainly for trade. These were long, sleek, and fast ships that gave them the ability to move goods more quickly, particularly to the Far East. They would eventually be replaced by steamships, but for a period of time, the clipper ships ruled the ocean and trade. And then the very last thing, not specifically mentioned on this PowerPoint, is the iron horse, the railroad. The very first tracks in this country were laid in 1828. However, they didn't make a really large impact until mid-century. By the 1860s, there were 30,000 miles of track in the United States, but 3/4 of the tracks were in the North. At this point in time, railroads still aren't very popular. They're not going to really see a rise in popularity till the post-Civil War era. They're seen as rather unsafe. But as we're going to be talking about in week 6, the railroads are going to play a role in the path to the Civil War. So in the end, what this era really is a tale of 2 revolutions. This era of the common man was a transportation revolution, linking many different parts of our nation now in different ways through roads, canals, steamboats, and telegraphs. Much of the emphasis on these links was centered in the north to the other areas. The south is largely left to using its rivers, which is going to breed some discontent and also pave the path to the Civil War. And then also a market revolution. Industry and business are both coming into maturity, and we're starting to see a significant rise from life on the farm to life on the job. The downside of this, as we'll explore as well in History 122, is the fact that the gap between richer and poorer is growing significantly. And this will unfortunately continue, although to the benefit of all, the overall standard of living is rising. So in the end, is this really the era of the common man? Enterprising self-made men were successful, but many of those who started out poor seldom actually made it to the top. It's more of an era of growing economic and social inequality if we look at it from a more realistic standpoint. Still, there were some successes. The white population of America was generally better off than European populations at this time. The new frontiers are raising levels of well-being and opportunity, and America still continues to be the land of religious and political freedom. So for this week in Blackboard, you will see assignments related to the Panic of 1837, as well as Andrew Jackson. An interesting debate has already begun on the discussion boards related to him. And there's also an assignment on the Seneca Falls Declaration. You should also be reading chapters 13 and 14 this week, and be sure to complete this week's Socrative. Additionally, you will see that I've opened the Unit 2 test. You have until February 21st to complete this test, which is the end of week 6. Because of where it falls in the semester, I've left it open longer than the previous test. You will see the same format, 15 true and false, 30 multiple choice, and then you will have one essay question where you will choose from one of the 3 questions. Again, please be very careful to make sure that you are reading the prompt and providing the information that the essay prompt is specifically asking for, so that you're not writing pages upon pages. I've narrowed the time frames for each of the essays based on the essential questions. So please make sure that you read those carefully. I will be able to answer questions on the test Wednesday night in class. So if you want to wait post Wednesday to take the test, that is certainly an option. And if you do have any questions before then, as always, please feel free to reach out to me via email. Hope you guys have a good couple days, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks again for bearing with me as I get better from this illness. Have a good night.
Who you was talking to? What?